Welcome to episode 11 of the SRA podcast. This is your host, AlexHumva, back for another week of fun and excitement and just all around great times, I'm sure. I did survive the hurricane. I realized the last episode came out late due to the hurricane, since I was down there in the hurricane relief mission down there in South Carolina out of North Georgia. That went really well. I think. But it has kind of messed up the podcast schedule, so I apologize for that. We are now on Fridays. This works a lot better that I can record in the middle of the week and then have it out by the end of the week, as opposed to recording at the end of the week and having it out in the middle of the week. That was getting weird, to say the least. Much like last episode, we are joined once again by, I believe, officially titled co-host now, Faye. She has returned once more.
I don't remember having a vote on that. You're going to have to start paying me at this rate.
I know. We'll split the $50 that I get after patrons' fees and everything, and the cut.
Speaking of, don't forget to donate to Alex's Patreon to keep this podcast running. You know, he doesn't get paid for this. This is all out of his time and his effort.
It's true. And we'll have an intermission in the middle of the show to discuss this more, because I need to shill myself out more often than I do, because I always end up recording ads for my Patreon, and then I cut them out because I feel self-conscious about it. But I need to stop doing that, because otherwise people don't realize I have a Patreon. So I should probably stop doing that.
Hey, you put yourself out there a little bit more, and in no time you'll be making those big Chapo bucks.
Oh man, I think Chapo Trap House is up to like 100,000 a month now. If something ridiculous like that. I don't know. All I know is it's a lot of money.
At this rate, they're going to be richer than Chapo.
I know. At this rate. So yes, podcast coming on Friday now, but also the hurricane relief efforts. Very successful. Very excellent. We stocked up 2 shelters, a church in Augusta, Georgia, and then a high school that was converted into a shelter in Orangeburg, I think. Something like that. Very, very good time. Had a very excellent shout out on the Guillotine podcast with Bones and Brent. I was absolutely flattered by their excellent discussion of the hurricane relief efforts. So big shout out to them for discussing it on their very popular platform.
And I think it's worth repeating the quote they pulled from your report, which you can find on socialistra.org. From Alex's report, the comment you left, we did not show up as a militia. We showed up as socialists ought to come to the people, with food to feed the hungry, water to quench the thirsty, and blankets for the cold. And I have to say that you, Alex, and the other members of the North Georgia chapter did a fantastic job getting out there, in these bad weather conditions, heading out to these people who needed help, and helping out where you could. Honestly, I'm really proud to have you all as members of the SRA, and I hope that we're able to do more actions like this in the future.
You can't see it because this is an audio format, but I'm blushing right now. It's quite flattering. But yes, it's if you'll believe it, I wrote that report on my plane flight back home, because for those who don't know, because that wasn't in the last podcast because it was recorded before all this hurricane stuff, I wrecked my car getting back home because Kansans aren't supposed to leave their home state. Kansas is nice and flat and dry, and our streets are laid out in a nice symmetric grid-like fashion. We run north, south, east, west, as opposed to Georgia, where you're going up and down, and for some reason, they felt the need to curve through the mountains instead of doing the rational thing and just destroying the mountain. That's what we did in Colorado. You just dig right through the mountain. But no, Georgia felt the need to make these long, line, spiraling roads. And alas, my Kansas driving skills were not up to the par and ended up having an unfortunate accident out in the hills. Thankfully, nobody was hurt, myself included. I was fine. There was nobody coming in the opposite direction. I left early in the morning, so it was just my car that took the blunt of the damage. But I'm okay. That's what counts. The membership rallied around the situation, got a GoFundMe started, and was able to raise the money for a plane ticket back home, as well as a little bit of extra money to put towards a new car, though when that will happen, who knows. Cars are a little more expensive than they used to be. So,
speaking of, you got to keep an eye out. I read a report earlier today. Apparently, already certain unscrupulous individuals are taking cars from the hurricane areas in North and South Carolina that were in the floodwaters, towing them off and doing minimal repairs and selling them as used cars on the side. Apparently, it's possible for a car to survive a flood and marginally function for a few days or weeks afterward until the salt water and chemical water residue left behind eats away and kills the electronics. So that's something you and a lot of anyone else who's looking at a new, used, pre-owned vehicle should probably be on the lookout for.
That is very unfortunate that we have people that are doing that. It's just somewhat despicable behavior, honestly. But alas, some people have no ethical qualms when it comes to making a couple bucks. So we will go ahead and move with that seamless transition into a man who has no ethical qualms about making a few bucks. Or in this case, spending a few bucks with no ethical qualms. Cody Wilson, he's been on the show before. Former...
Not in person, obviously.
Not in person, alas. That would have... Actually, that's probably for the best. My show might have taken a tank in the ratings if he had been on after the current events that are transpiring around him. So, to say the least, Cody Wilson, he's in a bit of hot water right now. As if it wasn't enough that half the U.S. state attorney generals decided that his 3D printing company was an affront against all that we hold dear and are suing his company, Defense Distributed / DefCAD. He, unfortunately, Cody Wilson, he's an ANCAP. For those who don't know, that's anarchist capitalist. He is a self-described crypto-anarchist, which, yeah, that's just ANCAP with more flavor. He has some very unfortunate views, and apparently these very unfortunate views translate to very serious actions in the real world, as he is now being charged with sexual assault against a minor. Apparently he paid a underage minor $500 for various services in a hotel room. This is not good, obviously, we'll go ahead and say.
Not totally unexpected, though. What is it with right-wing libertarians and pedophilia? It really seems like there's a trend.
Yeah, I could say that we could probably extrapolate some serious data from that. When these charges came out against him, he was out of the country in Taiwan. Why he was there, I don't know. Apparently, upon learning that he is facing charges, he attempted to stay in Taiwan. He missed his flight back home, and then was caught by the Taiwanese authorities as he was posing as a student trying to get an apartment in Taiwan. That the apartment property owner realized who he was, reported him to the Taiwanese authorities. The Taiwanese authorities arrested him, put him on the next plane back home, and the U.S. Marshals took him into custody. In the fallout from this, he has resigned as leader of Defense Distributed, and they have appointed a new president to take the helm. Let's see, I got her name around here somewhere. The new director of Defense Distributed, not new president. I don't know why I said president. Presidents and directors, they get mixed up in my head. The new director of Defense Distributed is Paloma Hindroff. She will be taking over operations of the company, keeping in mind that the company is the one being sued by all these state attorney generals. She will be taking it over during this time. Shipments of their USB drives with the schematics are continuing to ship out as expected. Apparently things are business as usual in the company, even though Mr. Wilson has resigned and it looks like is currently out on bail that he did pay his bail and is roaming around somewhere. So we'll see how this all goes down. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know the politics of the new director or any of the other board members or employees, but Cody Wilson is the sort of guy, him leaving this project can only mean good things for everyone involved.
Definitely. He is not an individual we want to be pushing this forward. I think
we've been giving I think the Marxist-Leninists call it critical support.
Yeah, critical support, or just I support what the idea is. I don't much like the guy behind the idea, especially given these new things coming to light. It's one of those situations that you can always hope for somebody better to be pushing these things forward, and unfortunately in the US we don't always get that. But I do think he will be at least seeing some justice for these actions. It seems like the marshals have a pretty solid case against Wilson, and the company is eager to throw off the dead weight around its neck that is Mr. Wilson and move on. It sounds like all the employees are taking it pretty well, which, given the man's beliefs, is maybe not much of a surprise.
We'll see how it shakes out. You know, like I said, it can only go up from here.
Indeed. We do also have some more gun news that a more established gun company, Smith and Wesson, has had a significant vote recently. So, for those who are unaware, Smith and Wesson, a popular firearms manufacturer, is owned by a holding company, American Outdoor Brand. So this company has a lot of different companies underneath it, including Smith and Wesson. There is a shareholder group called the Interfaith Center on Corporate Responsibility, and they pushed out a vote at the shareholder meeting about a resolution for Smith and Wesson to look into gun safety, what contributing factors Smith & Wesson has to making guns safer, what can be done to make guns safer. Should Smith & Wesson be looking at how it advertises to people, the sort of audiences that Smith & Wesson is targeting, basically things saying there's a gun problem in America, so the gun companies should start taking responsibility for it, is basically what this group is pushing. That vote succeeded. It passed through the shareholders meeting, and now I guess we'll see how that shakes out as far as what this report within the company does, whether or not the shareholders are going to try to push a particular agenda, for lack of a better word, on Smith & Wesson. I come from the perspective that I don't know what gun companies can necessarily do about gun violence. I think a lot of it is liberal media putting the blame on the wrong side of things. At the same time, I mean, obviously, it's a corporation. It exists to make a profit, which means it needs to sell its merchandise. And so maybe there is something to look into on how these things are advertised. But I'll be quite honest with you, and you can say if you've noticed this, but even in Kansas, which is a very pro-gun state, I don't really see advertisements for guns. I don't think I've ever seen an ad for a gun that wasn't in a gun store or in a gun-related setting.
Here in California, it's actually a law that gun stores are not allowed to advertise handguns on the outside of their buildings, which I think is very strange, because you can put up an advertisement in your window advertising rifles. You can advertise AR-15s as long as they're California compliant, but you can't advertise a handgun in your window. It's some law from the 80s. But regardless, gun advertisements are extremely rare here. I was actually surprised to see some roadside advertisements for the local gun show a few weeks ago. That was the first advertising of any kind that I've seen relating to guns in my corner of California.
I will say I have seen advertisements for gun shows. Those are up all the time, but usually they're really just plain advertisements that are just like, oh, there's a gun show at this location at this time. Usually there's no fancy imagery.
Yeah, pretty much. No pictures of guns on the ones I saw. I don't know if that's California law or just them trying, certain optics strategy. Who knows?
Yeah, I don't know. It's something that I look at this and I say, what can these companies do? And of course, the correct answer would be turn over the means of production to the workers. But as far as gun violence, I don't think that there's a huge amount that can be done. And people feel free to contact me and correct me about this, because this is honestly something I'm struggling to think of something that...
Well, the traditional liberal response is there's one of two approaches. Either you slap a bunch of safety features on the guns, which is how we get things like safeties on double action revolvers and, loaded chamber indicators on every single gun, mandatory sometimes. That's one response. The other is that they could be trying to enforce an assault weapons ban from the supplier side, so that rather than regulating the sale of firearms, they try to, through investor activism, try to force the company to not manufacture, say, rifles with high-capacity magazines or standard capacity, or whatever you want to call it, or to, reduce the total production of the guns that they sell. Although that might be difficult to enforce on a company. That's companies in America are encouraged to make as much stuff as they can possibly sell. So, but I think that's sort of the idea, is to try to do assault weapons sort of ban, sort of gun regulation from the top down, using the investor class to enforce the dictate rather than doing it through government mandate.
Yeah, it's an interesting approach, and I don't know what to think about it. I think that there's a lot of well-meaning people behind it. At the same time, it's the sort of thing that things, especially, just even in the name, the Interfaith Center on Corporate Responsibility, I think this just ties back into the thing of, can corporations be responsible? And the answer is no, not really, because, like you said, corporations are encouraged very heavily to make a profit at all costs. That's literally the law in a lot of states, that a for-profit corporation must act in the best interests of its shareholders. And that's how we get into these really bizarre situations. So it's one of those things that, I don't know, this corporate activism, I'm always distrustful of corporate activism, because it's rarely genuine. And it's bourgeois by definition. Oh yes, these shareholders have literally millions of shares. This is not someone's 401k account. This is
the religious group that pushed this. Apparently, it wasn't simply their votes alone, but they actually worked together with BlackRock and Vanguard, which are two very large investment firms, index sort of investment stocks, who hold between them a majority of Smith and Wesson stock. And so it was by convincing these literal Wall Street, massive giant corporation investment firms, convincing them to back this proposal. It's basically the definition of bourgeois. It's Wall Street activism, and they're probably approaching gun control from a very neoliberal perspective, and that they want to make it more and more difficult for civilians, and especially poor working class civilians, to own guns, while orienting more of the military-industrial complex towards producing weapons for the military and the police. So anything that comes out of this is not going to be good. We can hope that it just turns out to be more stupid safety features like revolver safeties, but I would expect it to be worse than that.
Oh, definitely. And honestly, I'd like to touch on this topic just a little bit too, so stuff like Vanguard. So if you're fortunate enough to be in the situation where your job provides you a 401k, you've probably seen different options, different stock investment things that you can get that have different growth periods and whatever. When I had a 401k, my company offered a lot of different options for their investment stuff. It's worth noting that, so this is literally, there are millions and millions of workers who contribute to a 401k, every week when they get paid on Friday or whatever. And where is that money going? I mean, you own it, technically, all kind of depending on vesting periods on your employer contributions. But you're storing that money when you're investing it. And I don't say this to discourage somebody from saving for their retirement. Please save some money for when you can't work, because I really doubt the government's going to come and save us. The era of Social Security is over. The system's bound to collapse in the near future. But as far as like thinking about when you're putting your money in these things, remember that's millions of workers contributing portions of their paycheck every Friday to these companies. And what are they doing? Yes, they're investing it for you to make some interest so that you can grow your retirement account, but they're still holding your stocks, and you're not deciding what happens with those stocks. So you
own the capital, but the capital is controlled by your broker.
Exactly. And so exactly that in a situation like this where you have Vanguard, that because it gets millions and millions of dollars dumped into it every week because people are putting away in their retirement plans, they get massive amounts of stock, and they have huge control in these companies to make decisions exactly like this. And it's absolutely spooky when you think about it, that workers have voluntarily, through this bizarre tax exemption that came about just by almost accident in the 80s, now do exactly this. And the same thing happens with pension funds too, that like the American Federation of Teachers has been saying, well, we're going to withdraw all of our stocks from gun companies, and we're going to move them into something else. And this is a very serious political tool in the world of capital, that deciding where you put retirement investments and deciding how those investments are used. This is serious money. This is a serious portion of the economy that people just don't think about the consequences of.
I mean, you look at it one way, the 401k and retirement system, basically workers are setting aside a portion of their salary that could be used towards capital in their own life, towards buying a house sooner or getting education, or some people would obviously use it for a higher standard of living, but that could also have health benefits. All this potential capital, all this potential use values that people could buy, if we want to be Marxist about it, all of this, instead of being used by the working class, starting businesses or anything else, it's being given back to the bourgeoisie with the promise that workers will get it with interest later. But they're discouraged from withdrawing from their 401k. They're discouraged from withdrawing money early because then they get an extra tax penalty. So basically, the system economically incentivizes workers to give control of their capital to the bourgeoisie, who then use it to wield political influence. I don't know if the system was designed with that in mind, but that is its basic effect. And it's kind of frightening when you think about it.
Oh, definitely. And those early withdrawal fees are nothing to blush at. When I left my job and I cashed out my 401k to go ahead and pay off some debts, 35% was withheld. And that's for both the fee and then the income taxes that you take a hit on from that. So I'm literally a third of it gone before I even see the check. So it's nothing. It's nothing to sneeze at, that's for sure. Because I know I actually worked with a guy in the warehouse when I was still picking boxes off the shelves, that he was a man in his 50s, and he hadn't quite hidden that. I think it's like 55 when you can start withdrawing, or there's special exemptions for like 55, and then you're supposed to withdraw when you're 65. So he was in his early 50s, and he had quit his job for a medical issue. And this is, man, he's getting up there in the years, so he's been contributing to his 401k for decades. And what ended up happening was he had to go on unemployment. He needed the money, so he went ahead and withdrew it. And he told me that between fees and taxes, the government took $40,000 out of his 401k. And so it's like $40,000. That's enough to live decently for a year as a single person. More if you stretch it out and ration it. So that's a lot of money to see your life work just go away.
Yep. I do want to make one more comment on this article. There's a comment in here. Smith and Wesson essentially was complaining that they said that this was a politically motivated attack on their company. I just want to sort of comment that out as the sort of executive hubris that you find at these sort of corporations. Everything economic is political, and everything political is economic. Investors deciding whether or not to invest in your company are never going to be doing it, almost never going to be doing it purely on the basis of, will this make me more money? Because odds are there's another company that will make them more than yours. It's based on tons and tons of political factors of whether or not they like your company. And so complaining that your investors in this case are pursuing a political agenda, it might be a bit more directly partisan than many other choices, but fundamentally it's no different than any other investor's choice to invest or not in the company based on their own personal feelings. So I just wanted to point out that sort of corporate whinging and call it out for what it is. I really have no respect for that.
Oh, absolutely. It is absolutely corporate whinging. And for the leadership of Smith and Wesson to come out and complain about this, it's just, it shows for exactly what it is, that it's nothing more than executives being hurt over this, when honestly, what does it even matter to these executives? The lifespan of a executive in a company is 5 to 10 years. It's not like they're going to be in this position for very long at all, honestly, in the corporate world. It's very common for chief executive officers and people like them to do a couple years, fulfill a contract, and then move right on to the next company. These guys don't have a...
And if they leave early, they're going to get a big old golden parachute. Maybe not as big at Smith and Wesson as at some other larger financial firms, but even if they leave early, they're still going to be making millions of dollars on their way out the door. So this is no sympathy.
Yeah, these guys are just, they can cry me a river into their millions and millions in stock options. This is going to be, there's no harm for them. There's absolutely no harm. Oh, but we can look at situations where there is harm going on, at least harm to feelings and maybe general society, if we're unlucky. Mr. Trump, President Trump, Supreme Leader Trump, Glorious Leader Trump, visited the UN. He got to conduct the UN General Assembly, and he got to give a rousing, glorious speech about just how great America is, how he's made America great again forever. And alas, during his rousing speech that just brings tears to the eyes of all the paid actors around him, unfortunately the UN did not receive it quite as well as he had hoped. At one point he said that his administration has accomplished more than any other administration in its first 2 years, and the UN General Assembly responded by laughing out loud, almost in uproarious laughter. He kind of chuckled along with himself and said he wasn't quite expecting that, and then he continued on. This is just sad, to be completely honest. It's sad for...
I mean, it's the greatest, what was supposed to be the end of history, the greatest empire in the world, just being laughed at. And it's, I mean, on the one hand, fuck imperialism, but on the other hand, man, what a way to decline. I mean, America didn't even get, 30 years in before they had their first Caligula? Yeah.
I mean, I'd give us a little more credit than that. We've been definitively an empire for at least the end of World War II. You can kind of make arguments going back.
True.
But I'd say
I was looking at it more in terms of versus the Soviet Union. Once you get to the 90s and the U.S. becomes the sole superpower, Pax Americana and all that sort of nonsense.
I can see that. Yeah, I can see that. Honestly, this is the sort of situation that I just look at it, I feel sad because, yeah, on one hand, we see the death throes of the empire. I mean, this is all empires rise and all empires fall. And that's just a fact of history. There is no eternal empire, and there never will be. At the same time, it's one of those situations where you just look at the situation and say, man, this is just sad. This is just
It's embarrassing.
It is absolutely embarrassing, is what it is. It is embarrassing, and I don't know at what point in history we can get our respect back. At the same time, I feel like when that time comes, America probably won't exist as we think of it today. That I think this is really the beginning of the decline. And I say that not to be melodramatic, but to be realistic because the problem here is that Trump's speech, besides getting laughter, was also really disturbing. That like he started going on about a lot of different stuff, and at one point basically said that America was built on patriotism, and we're going towards the future with patriotism. And the way he kept bringing this up, patriotism doesn't make sense in that context. That's not the right word for what he was describing, but everyone knows what the correct word is and why he didn't use it. The correct word is nationalism, and he kept talking in terms of nationalism, but he did not describe it that way because that's just too obvious. But it's very much the way his speaking is going, that America doesn't need the world, that America won't listen to the world, that America can do its own thing. These are nationalist tones. These are things that decry global unity or any sort of international partnerships and just go full blown into nationalist sentiment. And it's disturbing.
I'm not sure if there's ever been any real difference between nationalism and patriotism. I've always thought that the distinctions people offered are always a little bit, I haven't really bought it, but it's clear now that even the sort of, mild, subdued, wholesome patriotism of yore with the, apple pie and hot dogs and fireworks and the little American flags isn't really the sort of patriotism that people are talking about anymore. The patriotism that the right and conservatives are talking about is it's less of a civic nationalism and more of a full-blown militaristic military worship, police worship, state worship, sort of nationalism, sort of, it's fascist. It's fascist or getting close to fascist. It's been said many times. It's getting difficult at times to tell the principled conservatives from the unscrupulous white nationalists. They're blending into each other. Some of the extreme edges of the radical right are maybe disappearing or going underground, but the mainstream of the fascists and the conservatives has merged, and I think we're looking at a much more substantial right-wing movement than people even realize.
Oh, certainly. And I didn't have this in the show notes, but I'm going to touch upon it now because this is a perfect opportunity. And for parents who let their children listen to the show, first of all, why? And second of all, sorry, but explicit language coming. So Ted Cruz is running for Texas Senator again, because of course he is. And like we discussed previously on the podcast, a very sad case of Botham Jean, man shot dead in his own apartment doing no crime by an off-duty police officer. Ted Cruz is going out there and defending Amber Goyer, the officer who shot this innocent man dead in his own home. And what he is saying is complete and utter bullshit. And there is no defense of this, and yet he still offers this defense for this completely absurd situation that he's saying we can't jump to conclusions, that we have to give the benefit of the doubt. And this is coming from Ted Cruz, who is a self-described Tea Partier, a guy who wants to preserve freedom and the American ideal. And the only American ideal he is preserving is this idea that the state can come into your home and kill you on the spot and suffer no consequences. And certainly that does not line up with these supposed libertarian ideals that Ted Cruz claims to have. And yet here he is offering the defense of the state killing an innocent black man in his own apartment, doing no crime. And now we have the police searched this man's apartment and found some weed. So now he's obviously a criminal, when the amount that they found was nothing more than a fine. And besides that matter, he is in his own apartment. He was doing no crime. And yet people are still reaching to defend an agent of the state killing somebody in their own home. And it just blows my mind that this is how people react, that an innocent person dead in their own apartment, and yet we still have these supposed libertarians on the right saying, oh, but this, but that, but this, but that, when these are the people that are supposed to be saying, don't tread on me, when in actuality it just seems that they would be perfectly okay with certain people getting treaded upon, so long as it isn't them.
Libertarianism was never an ideology. It's always been an aesthetic. It's just a friendly, it's just a weed-friendly, gay-friendly, slightly more chill mask over the same old Republican racism, the same conservative traditionalism and nationalism and demand of respect for the state. And I think what people need to realize, and especially the Democrats, they need to realize they're not living in the West Wing. This is not a TV show, and politics isn't a friendly game between principled opponents. The right wing has adopted a nationalist, pseudo-fascist ideology, which is directly tied into the personality. It's a cult of personality around the president, around Donald Trump. Donald Trump is such a ridiculous, laughable, contemptible, untrustworthy joke of a human being, but he commands intense respect from so much of America's right because he is a strong figure who represents them and represents the state and represents legitimacy. And so that means that since Trump is in charge of the government, any aspect of the government, because Trump is the head of the government, all branches of the government must be respected as long as they don't involve Democrats. That means the police, that means the military, that means that there is this adoption of this nationalist, fascist ideology and aesthetic. And basically they have to defend their team. They have to defend the legitimacy of their avatar in Trump at all costs, which also ties into another segment, which is Brett Kavanaugh, our Supreme Court nominee and likely serial rapist.
Oh, I think it's more than likely at this point. He's got 3 accusers at this point that, and I use the terminology accuser, but really victim is better. That, yeah, he's got, at last I counted, 3 that have come forward about just outlandish things, and not outlandish in what they're saying as far as I do believe they're genuine. I say outlandish because it just seems so utterly blatant, this frat boy culture that was going on.
It sounds like deleted scenes from the worst, most vicious college movie ever. The, college frat house movie. It's like, I had a conversation with a coworker earlier today. Very sort of, conservative guy. We get into arguments about whether or not homeless people should be allowed to live. A totally normal human being. Even mentioning Kavanaugh to this person and even mentioning the allegations against him sent this person into an outright fit of anger, a state of agitation. He got up out of his chair, came around the cubicle, and started talking to me loudly in a voice at an offhanded comment I'd made that I'd intended to end the conversation with. Really set this person off, and the sheer vitriol and just refusal to even consider the truth of what Kavanaugh's accusers are saying, the speed at which he leapt to apologetics for Kavanaugh, the speed with which he leapt to coming up with any possible tangential reason why these women might be lying. It's honestly shocking to see someone with this much conviction to defend a rapist who's been quite credibly accused. We know that this man routinely gets blackout drunk, or at least has in his past gotten blackout drunk, who was a party animal in college. And he comes out on Fox News and makes this ridiculous statement saying that he was a virgin through college. And the context of that quote as well, saying, "Oh no, I've never sexually assaulted anyone. I was a virgin." Those aren't the same thing.
Also, can you imagine wanting a job so much that you go on public television and say that?
Not necessarily not losing your virginity through college, but having to come out and announce that publicly in front of the world as part of an extended job interview. Is that really worth it? Are you really willing to stand up and call these people liars, to tell these ridiculous stories on live television about having a calendar, keeping a calendar from high school where you wrote, "Definitely didn't sexually assault anyone today," in your calendar, and saying this on live air? And I find it difficult to be angry simply because I'm so shocked that people actually believe this, that it seems like this must be some sort of elaborate joke, that there's some sort of glitch in our universe. But unfortunately, it's the case that men simply don't believe women, that sexual assault is so trivialized, that rape is so trivialized in our society, that men are willing to willfully, not all men obviously, but a very large number of men are completely willing to just willfully disbelieve things that are evidently true, simply because it disagrees with their interest or it disagrees with their perception of a person. And once you bring partisan politics into it, and the sort of power that conservatives would wield by having yet another extreme conservative on the Supreme Court, just the willingness to throw women under the bus. Many of these men on the right have wives and children and parents that they care about, grandparents who have probably been sexually assaulted themselves at some point in their lives, or know someone who has been, and they're completely willing to trivialize their experience, completely willing to dismiss, a majority of victims and survivors of sexual assault and rape, and just dismiss their stories out of hand simply because those stories can conceivably be made up. They could be made up, or they could be used, for an explicitly political purpose, which is the go-to for things like this. The sexism in this country is so deep. There was a poll, I believe it was Ipsos. I don't have the source in front of me. Someone can correct me in the comments if I'm wrong, but there was a poll which was conducted after the first two allegations were made, but before the Fox News interview, where they found that the support for Kavanaugh among Republican women has dropped by 19%, while support for Kavanaugh among male Republicans has increased. Men are more likely to support this man now that he's been accused of rape, while a substantial minority of Republican women are willing to change their minds, likely based on their own experiences with sexual assault and other sex crimes and sexism and discrimination against women, who know that these things are true and who know that this man does not belong in the Supreme Court of the United States. And I think that's a really telling figure, 19% drop, and coincidentally a 16% drop among Republican women in support for Donald Trump, which hopefully translates into some better results next month or two with the November elections.
Oh, definitely. And this whole situation is just, I think it's something that's just kind of ingrained in society that is one of those things we just kind of take for granted. And I think a really poignant thing about all of this is, there's tons of stuff in the background basically going, there's a lot of stories about what was going on at Yale, what goes on at Yale today. And this, unfortunately, is not something unique to Yale. This is something found across college campuses, that there's a lot of these situations on college campuses where you have, especially in the fraternity culture, just just these awful situations. I mean, this stuff about like train and gang rapes. This is not something unique, I'm afraid. This is found across college and campus culture. It's just, I don't even know how to respond to it sometimes, because people just seem to accept this as a fact of life. That,
boys. It's unfortunate, but I do think that this culture is starting to change. I think that there's more accountability. Just a couple years ago, there was that boy who died at a college frat party, drank way too much and fell down some stairs, and and was throwing up, and they hit his head really bad. And you know what? And his friends didn't call the police. They just thought, oh, he's just drunk, he'll get better. And he ended up dying. Some of those boys who were at that party, men, really, since they're college age, men, who, refused to get that person to the hospital. Some of those men did receive, did end up being convicted of manslaughter, I believe. So I do think that, at least as far as taking fraternities to task, several of them have been forced to change, like racist or sexist slogans. There's the slogan, which was also the slogan unofficially of Kavanaugh's fraternity at Yale, was no means yes and yes means anal, which is obviously and no hints of rapiness to that at all that would corroborate these rape accusations. But a lot of these fraternities, these frats, are slowly being forced to change. But unfortunately, it is such a part of our culture. And colleges as institutions are very good at preserving this sort of behavior, perpetuating this cycle of debauchery and violence and sexual aggression. I don't think it's going to go away anytime soon, but I do think we are starting to get better. And and if Kavanaugh does fail to achieve his nomination, or even maybe receive some sort of punishment for his crimes, then I think that would definitely help speed things along. But the way things are going, Susan Collins and Jeff Flake are wavering a bit, but I still think the Senate's going to confirm him at this rate. I don't think they'll stop for anything.
Oh, certainly. I don't think his nomination is in question, especially after the quote-unquote nuclear whatever in the Senate, where we can now Supreme Court justices with just a simple majority. And whatever. One of the parties was bound to do it eventually. The Democrats lost all moral high ground when they invoked the nuclear option themselves, and whatever. It's all a broken system anyway, so... Oh, I guess we should probably pay some lip service to the fact that Rosenstein supposedly resigned, and then it turned out he didn't resign. He was going to make himself get fired, and it looked like he was fired, and now he's not fired, and now Trump says he's not going to fire him, and it's a whole stupid situation that this ongoing Russia stuff just...
The Democrats are all threatening to stage a huge protest. I signed up for it myself way back when I was still in the Bernie Crat sort of camp. They have 400,000 people on this list who've committed to going to a protest. Who knows how many actually will? Who knows how many will protest for more than a day or two? I've seen people on Reddit and Twitter, liberals, talking about a general strike, which would be great if their idea of general strike wasn't taking a few days of paid vacation, holding a sign outside during the day for a couple of days on a weekend maybe, and then going home because they have to pay rent, like you do in a general strike. I don't think they know what a general strike means. I just think they heard Chapo Trap House listeners talking about it, and I don't think they quite got the concept. A general strike means you don't spend any money. That means no money for the landlord, no money for the taxman, no work for your boss. You buy your groceries in advance, you live off canned goods, and it's a war of attrition against the government. It's basically the citizens' version of a government shutdown. And it's not your freaking Women's Day march or your, January 21st anti-Trump march where you go out and you wave a sign and you get it all out of your system and you feel better afterwards. A general strike is a serious proletarian tactic against the government and the bourgeoisie. And the liberals have no concept of how to do that or how to have an effective protest of any kind. So any sort of demonstration, any sort of protest that comes out of Rosenstein's firing or resignation or whatever else is probably going to be completely ineffective. Especially if Trump gets his Supreme Court nominee, it's all really pointless. So for any leftists out there, all I can really say is, maybe use the opportunity to radicalize some people. Hey, your peaceful protest hasn't fixed anything. Have you considered Molotovs? You can go out there and do that if you like, but I don't think anything's going to come of it.
Yeah. As a syndicalist, I love me some general strike. General strikes are great, but yeah, taking some PTO from the old boss, asking your boss, hey, can I take some days off of work? Probably not what Amelia Puget was thinking when he said strike. I don't think that was what he was quite getting at in his works, but
please, Mr. Bossman, can I go on strike?
The absurdity of the situation, but that's liberals for you. We love them, but we also hate them.
Liberals, they're not Republicans.
So we'll move quickly on from this because I'm sure this will be a whole episode unto itself in my new 50-part series on Russia and Trump and why. You've
been working on that for a while. Is that ever coming out?
No, it's never coming out. It's just, no. It's going... It will come out at the end of history, is when it'll come out. It will be the end of history.
The end of history is communism, so at least it'll be a happy day.
Indeed. We'll move to our favorite state in the Union, California.
I wish.
Bastion of leftists and socialism, communism. It's where all the Che Guevara lovers live, and they run things as just all according to the principles of Karl Marx. Everything runs just all like that.
Yeah, I sure own. Here I am, my socialized housing that I pay thousands of dollars a month to live in, and with my free healthcare that I pay hundreds of dollars a month in premiums for and can't afford to actually use, and, get all my free avocado toasts and Starbucks coffee shipped to me by Amazon drone every day, provided by our glorious leader, Comintern, Jeff Bezos, of course. But unfortunately...
So, California's been doing some reforms recently, and one of the reforms they recently did was bail reform. So, for those who have never had a run-in with the criminal justice system or watched an episode of Law & Order on the television, bail is a system of where you are arrested, the police charge you with some crime. You get charged, you get booked into the county jail, and the judge looks at your charges, looks at the preliminary evidence, and says, well, by some mechanism based partially in law and based partially on my own personal discretion, I say you need to pay $1,000 to get out of jail until your trial. And you can go to the jail clerk and pay your $1,000 or have somebody else pay your $1,000, and they'll let you out of jail until your trial when you are actually tried and determined to be guilty or innocent. And in the meantime, you can be wandering around town, continuing your life. This also produces the industry of bail bondsmen, which are companies where they pay your bail for some fee, usually 10%. So in this case, you'd pay the bail bondsman $100. He'd post bail for you. This is an extremely exploitive industry. There's not really much good that comes out of this. It sounds good in principle. It really, introducing capitalism into the Law and Order system never got any good results. So, as one might realize from just this preliminary hearing of the bail system, is they say, well, what happens if I don't have $1,000? And what happens if I don't even have $100 to give to the bail bondsman? And the answer is you sit in jail. That's what happens. You sit in jail until your trial, which, due to the fact that the American court system is notoriously underfunded and relies heavily on plea bargains just to do day-to-day functions, if you decide not to do a plea bargain, which both prosecutors and attorneys appointed on your behalf if you're too poor, which if you can't pay bail, probably in that situation, though not always, you're basically in the situation where you can literally be waiting a year or more for trial, which, by the way, is a violation of your constitutional right to a speedy trial, but all attempts to rule this unconstitutional have proven impossible because the courts just keep saying we're too underfunded. So we're not going to rule this unconstitutional because we're too underfunded. We physically can't get to people faster. And that's why these plea bargains exist, where the attorney that the state appoints for you will say, well, look, I've talked to the prosecutor, and if you just accept this lesser charge, then we'll be done. You'll get out of jail. Maybe you'll just do some time on probation or whatever. It'll be fine. It's an awful system. It's an awful thing, what we do. So, obviously, as part of this thing, with this bail reform, it's trying to make a little bit of progress in this, of saying, okay, you don't have enough money to post bail. Maybe we shouldn't have bail in the first place. Maybe it shouldn't be that you can literally buy a get out of jail card. That maybe you shouldn't be able to just buy that. Maybe this should be done more fairly. And it's a commendable initiative. The groups like the ACLU were supporting this measure. And then it kind of all went haywire at the end, is what I'm getting at.
There were several last-minute amendments to the bill. So the issue with getting rid of bail is, okay, so you can't buy your way out of jail anymore using bail. All of a sudden, now you have all these people who are in jail who otherwise would have been bailed out. So first, that leads to overcrowded jails because, suddenly there's a 20, 30, 50% increase in the number of people being incarcerated there for who knows how long. And furthermore, being in jail is very disruptive to your life. It's being in jail, you can't pay your rent, you can't work to make income, you can't see your family, you can't do anything. You're behind bars and you can only be visited or send very limited mail out if you're lucky. It's very disruptive being in jail, even for just a few months while awaiting trial. Even if you're ruled innocent, it can still ruin your life. This is actually used as a weapon against leftists. For instance, one of the organizers of the Huey P. Newton Gun Club was targeted for this, and eventually he was cleared. But the several months that he spent in jail really significantly impacted his life and made it much more difficult for him to survive. Now you have this already unfair system that was being applied to many people is now being applied to more people. You don't have the get out of jail free card anymore, but that doesn't make the underlying jail system any more just. And so there are certain other ways to get out of being held in jail. You can do a risk assessment tool. There's various bureaucratic measures where you can appeal your case, and a panel or a judge will look at your case and decide whether or not you're a big enough risk that they have to incarcerate you, or whether you're just a normal person who may be screwed up or was falsely accused, and it's safe to release you to the public without having to pay bail. So again, now there's a way, if you can, it's no longer based on money, but if you can prove that you're a good person, that you're fundamentally safe and you give your word and everything, you can be let out as a low risk assessment individual. The issue with this is these tools, there are no judicial standards for them. There are no laws dictating how these rulings of these risk assessments are to be carried out. And so it often functions much like a prison parole board, where it's very much based on the personal decisions of the people doing the review, their personal prejudices. And as we all know, there's systemic prejudice against people of color in our society, against poor people, against queer people, against every minority group in this country, which means that you have not the same, but a very similar issue that the people that are going to be getting out under this new system instead of bail, under this expanded risk assessment system, are still going to be relatively privileged white people. You're going to have even more people sitting in jail, having their lives ruined, with no way out, even paying a fraction of bail through a bondsman, however exploitative that is. At least you're not in jail. People aren't going to have that option anymore. So it's in a way, it's sort of leveled the playing field, but it simultaneously hasn't leveled the playing field enough, and the game is still rigged against the people who are incarcerated, and it still ruins lives. So this is an example of a good-hearted liberal reform, an attempt to make our society more just, but the end result is simply exacerbated the problems of the underlying system. Liberal reforms don't solve societal problems. They're band-aids. And if you want to fix a system like the prison industrial complex and our broken trial system, you need a revolutionary change rather than simply a shifting of small change of rules or resources.
Oh, definitely. It's one of those situations that, yeah, this is road to hell is paved with good intentions. It's the sort of situation that, I mean, there's not too much to say on it other than maybe giving a bit of perspective from my background in computer science. I've heard a lot of talk about algorithmic ways of determining if somebody should be in jail or not, and algorithms are not divine. And this is a serious problem, I feel, especially in California, where we have Silicon Valley, where you have all these tech libertarians that feel like computers are going to save us all. And don't get me wrong, I love computers. Computers make my life very, very nice, and they're my chosen career path. At the same time, algorithms are not magic. Algorithms are not genies that can just make everything right. In fact, they can often be described as genies of old that would twist your wishes. That you can design some glorious algorithm that ends up having its own inherent biases. Or I've heard a lot about machine learning for criminal justice, which is just the silliest thing I've ever heard, because machine learning, again, it's not magic. There's very complex linear algebra going on underneath the hood, and
it's garbage in,
what's
garbage out.
going?
You give it you give it racist data, you're going to get a racist robot. Just like that chatbot on Twitter or wherever, they got brigaded by white supremacists and they ended up making a Nazi chatbot. It's the same thing, only you're giving it racist police data, racist arrest statistics, racist, just the entire system of justice. All of our metrics for measuring crime are all biased against people of color. And that's going to result in an algorithm which is biased against people of color because it embodies the bias inherent in the system.
Absolutely. And one of the best examples I can think of from my studies in machine learning, and this kind of honestly probably one of the areas I'm going to specialize in if linear algebra doesn't kill me first, is exactly this. And one of the best examples I can think of is when one of the common uses of machine learning is to learn pictures, what's in a picture. And a use was determining the difference between a dog and a wolf. So the data scientists gave it a bunch of pictures of wolves and gave it a bunch of pictures of dogs. And miraculously, it was able to tell the difference between dogs and wolves very well. Until somebody realized, when they started giving it some different pictures, that it hadn't learned how to pick dogs and wolves apart, but that every wolf picture they gave it was on a snowy background, whereas every dog picture they gave it was in a nice green grassy background. And so it learned to pick up the background, not the dog versus the wolf. And it's exactly the same thing can be said of trying to make some kind of neural network based on criminal justice statistics, that you're not going to get what you want.
And even if it did work, is that really a society that we want to be in, where we have a machine that will predict crime, that will prejudge people, or that will, metaphorically peer into someone's soul to see if they're worthy of walking the streets or not? I think Isaac Asimov wrote a couple of short stories about that way back. I have one of his collections. And I think there's a lot of moral questions that tech libertarians fail to ask as they pursue these ideas, blinded by their greed and blinded by their ideology, that they believe that technology and benevolent capitalism will always save the day. And honestly, it looks like we're rushing headlong more and more into a dystopia.
Oh, absolutely. I'm becoming increasingly of the belief that Deus Ex is actually just straight up pathetic, and that we're bound to get to that point any day now. I think the games have it as 2026. I think that might be a little optimistically far out. It might get there sooner than expected. So we'll leave California with just a quick thing that I saw while researching this, that Jerry Brown got interviewed by somebody. And first of all, consider me extremely shocked. Jerry Brown's been doing this for 40 years now, and just, good Lord, a man in singular politics for 40 years. That just, I understand there's a lot of Congress people up on the Hill that have been doing this for a real long time, and the career politician is nothing new, but still 40 years is just staying in state politics is incredible to me. But he got his brain picked. And one of the things was, of course, the hot topic in the Democratic Party right now is, should we move to the left? These scary leftists coming into the party, these radical revolutionaries like Bernie Sanders. Should we accept these radical teachings? And his thoughts on it were, every time the Democrats elect somebody, quote unquote, leftist, that they get a reaction. So when they elected Bill Clinton, well, then they got 8 years of Bush, and then they elected Obama, and now they're going to get 4 to 8 years of Trump. And this is just one of those things that it gets so close to the truth, and just completely misses the point. That yes, there is absolutely a reaction, but it's not a reaction to some quote-unquote leftist. Bill Clinton is not a leftist. Obama is not a leftist. Bill Clinton was a new Democrat. He spearheaded the conservatization of the Democratic Party and stripped them of any sort of inklings of leftism that you might say they had during the 60s and 70s and 80s. He stripped the party of that and embraced this neoliberal, neoconservative ideology.
And Obama, of course, tried to pursue his compromise at all costs, drone strike anyone in the way sort of policy with some mild social liberalism. And even that was enough to send the right wing into the fits of racism, a paroxysm of bias that led them to electing, Donald Trump. The idea that electing a leftist would cause any less of a reaction than electing another, centrist, compromised Democrat, the right wing is going to work themselves up into a lather either way. There's no backing down. This isn't a reactionary movement anymore, at least in partisan terms. They're not reacting against the Democrats. They're reacting against the perceived economic and social situations they find themselves in. And the Democrats are just a scapegoat. They're just an avatar that the right can point to and blame all of their woes on. And no matter who the Democrats elect, they will always be accused of being communists. They'll always be accused of being terrorists. They'll always be accused of being weak on crime and weak on foreign policy, because these things are axiomatic truths of the Republican worldview. And it's not going to change. It's not going to matter whether we have Joe Biden or Bernie Sanders on the ticket. The reaction is going to be the same. The left doesn't need to elect its version of Donald Trump in order to get a reaction from the Republicans. If anything, the fact that it took Donald Trump to wake up the Democrats to the reality of this situation, and not even totally successfully, should show you how myopic and naive and optimistic the Democratic Party has really been. for the past several decades.
Absolutely. It's ridiculous because, of course, there's a reaction. This is something that's central to leftist political thought. Is, of course, there's a reaction. That's the whole thing of reactionary politics. It's this idea of the reaction is central to our belief system and what we can expect to face. And to miss the point so completely is just it's frustrating. But of course, Jerry Brown is no leftist either. He's very much a centrist.
He's an asshole.
Liberal.
He's an asshole. Los Angeles legalized street vending and stopped the LAPD from beating up street vendors, so Jerry Brown sent in the California Highway Patrol to do it instead. Overruled the city and county decision to allow people to make a living selling tacos in downtown LA, and the state decided to intervene because Jerry Brown is an asshole and he's a neoliberal, and he's not the worst person in politics, but he's certainly not a good one.
Well, I think that's as good of a statement. Jerry Brown is an asshole.
Sorry for the
depart
language.
From, I already gave an explicit content warning at the beginning, so.
Fair enough.
I don't know what Apple's standards are. That's the only thing I have to worry about is iTunes. If I have to label these things, I'll probably bleep out a couple things and take my chances with the rest. Speaking of assholes, though, we have the Jacobin. Favorite of the Bernie-crats, this kind of pseudo-leftist thing. Apparently, they've been getting better in recent days.
They've been having some good takes the past couple months. A lot of the usual social democratic sort of bullcrap, but there's been some genuine leftish takes coming out of Jacobin recently. But transitioning from one asshole to another, the Jacobin's chief publisher, Bhaskar Sankara, not sure, some kind of pronunciation. He is the man in charge of the Jacobin, and he has recently spearheaded a buyout of the Tribune newspaper. Basically, this paper is a really historical paper in Britain for the left. The Tribune had people like George Orwell writing for it, and is a really significant leftist paper in Britain, very significant with the labor movement and the unions. Unfortunately, it's come on hard times recently. Its membership has really declined. People aren't paying their subscriptions anymore. It's kind of part of print media in general, part of that overall decline. So the Jacobin has come in and bought them out. And for the last, I guess, year or two, there's been some really dedicated workers who have agreed basically not to get paid and keep the newspaper alive in this hard time until somebody could buy it out. And so they've been working basically for free to keep this going. And what ended up happening is Mr. Sankara promised 70% back wages to the workers that had kept the newspaper going and to rehire workers that had quit to allow the newspaper to keep going. After making this promise to the workers, he decided that that wasn't that great of a deal and just straight up cut them out. Didn't give them their pay, didn't rehire anyone, and just is basically doing what robber barons of old would do, and honestly of what robber barons today in the capitalist system do, of these businessmen who come in and scalp companies and take them for all they're worth and leave unemployed workers in their wake. I hadn't known much about the ownership of Jacobin before this. I wasn't aware of who Mr. Sankara was, but from what I've read, Mr. Sankara is a trust fund multimillionaire from an elite suburb of New York City with vaguely social democrat, benevolent, authoritarian sort of views, and he basically is not a friend to the left in any way, and the left lean of Jacobin is more a marketing decision on the part of Sankara and the other administrators of the Jacobin, the other senior management. It's a marketing decision to appeal to a certain demographic, and while the writers may be sincere leftists, the management Mr. Sankara is a bourgeois multimillionaire, apparently quite a brash, arrogant person, from people who've met him face to face. And really I hadn't really studied the Jacobin all that much beyond reading the occasional article, but apparently Jacobin has been underpaying its writers systematically. Normally, a publication the size of Jacobin would pay its writers several $100s per article as a fair compensation for the work performed. Instead, Jacobin has claimed that its budget is too tight, it's too strapped for cash, it's a leftist magazine, it's not that well funded, it can't afford to pay writers a fair wage, so it's been typically paying something like, $50 or at most $100 per article to these leftist writers who are writing about socialism and social democracy and justice and fairness. These people are being taken advantage of and underpaid, being told that the company can't afford to pay them more, but suddenly here comes Jacobin paying out probably for the ownership. It was purchased from a football team, probably at least in the millions of dollars for this paper, and they're saying that they couldn't afford to pay a decent wage to the writers who've been basically fueling Jacobin's success for the past several years. Writing is a working class job for most writers. It's a proletarian profession. Marx was a writer for newspapers, and these writers were being taken advantage of by yet another bourgeois capitalist, what Zizek would call a liberal communist, contradiction in terms, who pretends to be friendly to the left but is actually just as greedy and vicious and exploitative as any other capitalist out there.
Absolutely. And having done copy work before, I can say $50 an article is poverty wages. Like that's just absolutely outrageous that somebody would pay $50. $50 an article is what PC Gamer pays for a write-in from a non-professional writer, that you can just write an article for them, and even they pay more for in a non-professional role if you get your story selected to get posted there. For actual genuine copy work, writing articles, getting contracts, it's absolutely outrageous to see somebody get paid $50 when it's not a matter of time. It's not a matter of how many hours that you spend on this. It's a matter of an article is worth a lot to that newspaper where it's getting published. The ad revenue, the sponsorships that go on it. There's a lot of money behind it. That $50 is just a serious outrage. So,
especially considering that Jacobin is at this point the largest left-leaning, like hard left publication. Maybe not hard left. There's still a lot of social democracy on there, but it's a large publication. They have over 1 million subscribers. That has to be generating revenue. They certainly don't skimp on ads. I can tell you that.
Certainly. We'll go ahead and put a pin in this and move into our lightning round before our final story of the night. We've gone on quite a bit at this point. So new Apple stuff. They just recently announced some Apple products, new iPhones, new watches, new things of that nature. The more expensive Apple iPhone now costs like $1,500. So, take of that what you will. A feature that they've included on their latest watch, though, they've made a new Apple Watch, and it's got some fancy sensors that can tell if you've fallen. And so for individuals that enter their age as 65 or above when they set up their watch, it will automatically turn on a feature that if they fall, and then I think it's like after a minute or two, if they don't tap on the watch to say they're okay, then it will start a 15-second countdown. And if they don't respond during that time, then it will call 911 and send help. This again, good intentions. Having seniors who might be living by themselves and fall down the stairs, of course we want help for them. Unfortunately, some lawyers have brought up the fact that by calling 911, you're inviting the authorities into your home. And so if under the plain sight doctrine, if you've invited a officer into your home, in this case because your watch called 911, and for whatever reason there's something out on your countertop that might not be totally allowed. For instance, if you're an older individual and maybe you take some medicinal substances for back pain or these things that happen when you enter your older years, and maybe those medicinal substances aren't legal in your state yet, that could cause you some serious issues that your watch has just now invited the police into your home to be able to see that.
And that's a real shame, because I think this is a good idea. My grandmother fell before she passed away. And, something like this, it's really good intention. It seems like it could help a lot of people. Unfortunately, the problem in this case is not with the technology. The problem was with the police and with the justice system that sees, having a few joints on your counter as a crime worthy of imprisoning you away from society. This is the sort of thing that shouldn't be an issue, but is made an issue by our country's ridiculous laws. And so I think it's a shame that this is a potential side effect, because I like the idea. But
oh yes, it's very much one of those situations. Technology making our lives better, except that society has not advanced. The technology is going too quickly, I suppose. That society has not quite caught up to where we are. Another quick story. As anyone who watches the news is aware, millennials have killed everything. Millennials have killed just absolutely everything. One of my college professors, his door is plastered with headlines of all the things millennials have killed. There's some really funny memes you can find out there. So amongst all the various things millennials have killed, apparently they're killing divorce as well, as the divorce rate since the early aughts, it looks like, has kind of tapered off. And now some deeper statistical studies are showing that millennials, while they are less likely to marry, when they do, apparently are also less likely to divorce, which is fascinating considering that I naturally get all of my news from Mr. Sean Hannity, the best news source ever. And Mr. Sean Hannity was telling me that young people are depraved and have no values anymore. And this is ruining my
when you think about it
right now.
Are millennials killing divorce, or did baby boomers kill marriage?
That's something to consider.
That's what Marx would call a concrete inversion.
Before we get into our final story of the night, so for anyone who has listened to this extra long, extra special episode, thank you for sticking out with it. We've had some good discussions so far. I love being able to talk into the late hours of the night about just anything and everything. If you have stuck through this, obviously you're enjoying the content that is being produced. And perhaps if you really enjoy the content being produced and you feel like the content producer should be able to eat, I have a Patreon, patreon.com/socialist.ra podcast. You can go there. I have one tier. It's a $5 a month tier, the people's tier, the only tier that matters. It helps. I can buy spaghetti with it. Every contribution is 5 boxes of spaghetti, is how I look at it. So it's fantastic. And you get access to special premium content, like premium content being recorded this very night. As far as special episodes, I also post some essays there every now and then. I need to get on some book readings, things of that nature. There's some premium content to make it worth your while if you don't feel like just tossing some money out there without getting something in return. So that is my pitch. So let's get right into the final story of the night, which is the apocalypse. So I'm sorry, everyone. The world is ending. The end is upon us. The end of history has come, and unfortunately, it is not communism. It is just I don't know how the world's going in. I think NASA said there's an asteroid coming in 2030 something that might hit us and obliterate us all. Maybe a gamma ray burst comes through and destroys the electrical grid. Maybe Trump just loses it one day and hits the red button in the White House and launches all the nukes. Who can say? Who can say how it all ends? Maybe capitalism just destroys itself and we descend into anarchy. The bad kind of anarchy. No, not the good kind of anarchy. So the end is coming and the rich see it. And so the rich have started indulging in this sort of apocalypse insurance, we'll call it. That this is actually a story kind of near and dear to me because a lot of these businesses have set up shop in Kansas and throughout the Midwest because Kansas in particular, due to the nuclear strategy of the United States during the Cold War, it was basically determined that they didn't want to put nuclear silos in urban areas for obvious reasons, that if the enemy attacks your nuclear silo and it's in an urban location, then a lot of people die. This is kind of short-sighted because their answer was, okay, let's put it out in the middle of the farms, but now all your farms are destroyed and radioactive, so how are those people in the urban centers going to survive when they don't have farms? But that's besides the point. Matter is that Kansas has a bunch of old missile silos that aren't in use anymore since the Cold War is over, and Russia was our friend until they weren't, when it was politically convenient for them to be and not to be. So we have a bunch of defunct missile silos. Benefit of a missile silo is it's really solid concrete and it's designed to survive a nuclear war. So they're pretty tough things. And the government has been selling them on the cheap to raise some funds. And some companies, like the Survival Condo Project, which is about 2 hours north of Wichita, where I am, has bought out a missile silo and converted it into a luxury apartment complex for the super rich who wish to ride out the apocalypse, which joke's going to be on them when the United Syndicalist state of Kansas rises from the ashes and pillages it, but
It's sort of telling that the wealthy are preparing for the end of the world while telling all the rest of us that everything's fine. Capitalism's doing great. Global warming, it's not that big a deal. You can keep using oil. We're just going to be over here stockpiling food and guns in underground concrete bunkers with steel blast doors. But, that's just a hobby, It's just for funsies. You don't have to worry about anything.
I think the article I was reading described it as LARPing, playing a video game in real life.
There's lots of ways to LARP without spending millions and millions of dollars on underground bunkers. And I know for these people, millions of dollars is, afternoon spending money at the mall or something. But, it gives me bad vibes. And in addition to the nuclear silos, one thing that a lot of these billionaire survivalists are doing now is they're going overseas. Apparently, a great many of them have decided to put down bunkers in New Zealand. The Kiwis are way out there in the middle of the ocean, far away from everyone, far away from the fallout patterns. It seems like a pretty good place to ride out the apocalypse. Lots of sheep, lots of hobbits. But, It's a multi-billion-dollar industry of making these wealthy autocrats feel safer in their underground holes.
Oh, absolutely. And it's the reason these stories interest me so much. It's a real interesting thing watching the rich try to do this. And this guy, I have this quote written down from Garcia Martinez that he says. He's talking about how you want your shelter to be away from the city, but not too far. And then he goes on to say, quote, all these dudes think that one guy alone could somehow withstand the roving mob. No, you're going to need to form a local militia. You just need so many things to actually ride out the apocalypse. And it's fascinating to me that this is hitting on a very poignant point. Well, still missing the point, because it's true that the lone survival is it's a myth. It's a story to tell in movies. You don't survive any sort of catastrophe on your own, because it's a military saying, but 1 is none and 2 is 1.
So you have this situation where you have these, rich billionaires who want to survive the apocalypse. So, okay, you get your shelter, you get your supplies. Okay, well, now you need a guy to maintain the electronics and the air filter in your shelter. Okay, so now you have an electrician. You're going to need somebody to take care of your weapons, unless that's a major hobby of yours. You're not going to know how to be a gunsmith unless you just have so many guns that you get rid of them. Eventually, you're going to run out of food, and you're going to need people who know how to farm. You're going to need farming equipment and people to maintain that. You're going to need you're going to need people around you just to stay sane. And suddenly, you're not just talking about you and a couple family members surviving the apocalypse. You're talking about an entire group of people. A dozen people, probably minimum. More likely, somewhere in the range of 20 to 50 people to be a viable community of survivors. And at that point, what's the point in having a billionaire around? Because they don't have any life skills, because they've been using their money to buy everything for most of their life. Why would anyone listen to what this spoiled brat has to say? Why wouldn't they organize amongst themselves? Or why couldn't some strong man within the group take control and get rid of the billionaire? What's the point in having one of these people around when you have this community of skilled people who don't need them? What do they think is going to happen?
Oh, absolutely. You can argue maybe society reverts to a feudalistic state and the billionaire becomes king, queen, or whoever, which ignores the fact that, for most of human history, monarchs survived because they did have some kind of appreciable skill. They were usually had to be good in combat because kings win by bigger army diplomacy. And so you need to know how to actually defend yourself. And I really doubt any of these rich people we have today would know how to defend themselves in a apocalyptic situation, especially when they require an entire society just to sustain them. So I don't really think they're going to come out on top of that. It's interesting because this survival condo project that's outside of Wichita, it's not my first time that I've read about them. And it's these guys, obviously it's a fleecing scheme for the guy running it. And if you want to make your life's living off of parting rich people with their money, I don't think there's more honest work than that. But at the same time, some of his ideas are just so silly as to how it works. So these missile silos that they've taken over, they're guarded by armed security around the clock. And it's supposed to be that if something does go down, then all these rich people, they get into their private jets, they get into their Humvee, they drive out, they get to the shelter, they get in, which, these shelters, the location of these missile silos are public knowledge. You can find them on satellite imagery. So, the idea is that these armed guards will be able to stop, a force from getting to the missile silo, breaching the defenses, which, looking at what they've got, I'm sure they've got security measures that aren't made public, but it looks like a couple of guys with ARs, and frankly, if any sort of coordinated attempt after some societal collapse by a well-structured group, and there will be well-structured groups afterwards, because it's just how society never truly collapses. We never get to a situation where it's every man for himself. It's always, there will be groups of people that get together that survive the situation and band together to help themselves and help each other. A sniper, honestly, that's all it takes. 1 or 2 snipers could probably defeat the security measures of the silo, at which point you have access to the outside of the silo, at which point these silos were not designed to survive invasion. They were designed to survive nuclear war. So they were not designed with the intention of mind that there are enemy soldiers outside and you need to keep them out. Their design was you survive the initial blast so that you can launch your own rocket. So just as a result, it's any sort of coordinated effort is going to be able to defeat this, alongside the fact that, do you think your armed security is going to stick around? Why would armed security stick around after society falls? Why would they have any reason to listen to their rich patrons.
Why wouldn't they move into the shelter themselves?
Exactly. Society has fallen. Money is meaningless. Do you think your dollar bills are going to work? Do you think your debit card is going to work when society is gone? Money ceases to have any meaning. Resources become meaningful. Food becomes meaningful. Do you have food? Because that's what's going to be the currency, is things that can keep you alive. Food, medicine, water. Are these rich people going to have that? Because I really doubt it. Good luck convincing the security guard why he shouldn't go into the silo, lock the door behind him, and just leave you for the Mad Max hellscape outside.
Yeah, the whole thing is a scam, and it's a scam against rich people. So like you said, fine by me. But yeah, it sort of shows also sort of how delusional some of these people are, how deep in ideology they are, that they don't really think about the material consequences of their own survival plans and what would actually happen. These people don't understand how society works. They don't understand how economies work outside of the hyper-specialized role that they play. And so, this is what happens when you give massive amounts of capital to people who are totally unqualified to use it, aside from the fact that they were capable of generating more capital. Your ability to make money doesn't make you smart.
Especially when a lot of these folks have inherited their money. That definitely there's a lot of old money out there that, and you can see it in people like our current president, who received small $1 million loans.
Elon Musk used to walk around with emeralds in his pocket from his father's emerald mine in apartheid South Africa.
There's a lot of that, and we are definitely past the days where Andrew Carnegie shows up as a young Scottish immigrant with no money and finds his way into fame and fortune. It still happens. The situation that I think of is Marcus Peterson, I think. I know him better by his handle Notch, the creator of Minecraft, that he went from being nobody in Sweden, making a game in his basement, and then he sold it to Microsoft for $2 billion, and now he's a billionaire, and he is just the saddest sack alive, because
he's just a racist, misogynist, gamer nerd on the internet. He has $2 million now. Or sorry, $2 billion.
And not to divert the conversation too much, but I mean, this kind of plays into it, that if you want to see how rich people act and why they're probably not going to make it for the apocalypse very well, Notch, upon finding fame and fortune, with his $2 billion, went and bought this big old mansion, and then covered an entire room in candy dispensers and soda fountains.
Oh my god!
And it's the saddest thing now, though, because he spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on just tons of candy and filled this room with just tons of candy dispensers. Just a ridiculous amount of money. But he has no friends, and nobody goes and hangs out with him. And so now all the candy has gone bad. And so now he just has a room in his mansion just filled with spoiled candy, and is the most perfect metaphor for the type of person he is.
Oh my god, I didn't know that, but that is exactly the type of thing that Notch would do.
So, he is... It's this sort of mentality, and of course, some snobby old money person would be like, well, that's what happens when the peasantry gets money. That of course the peasantry, when if you look at what the super rich spend their money on, these proper bourgeoisie people who have so much money that it's very difficult for them to even be able to lose their money. That the sheer thing of compound interest, when you have enough money, eventually you can make enough just off of interest alone that you gotta really mess up to be able to lose that much money. It's one of those situations that rich people can and do spend money on really stupid things. And I mean, for crying out loud, Peter Thiel runs a blood clinic wherein he pays teenagers for their blood and then sells it to rich people. This is the sort of thing that rich people
vampirism.
do. Yes, this is literally... It's almost comical just how this is, and yet here we are. There's actual rich people paying for teenager blood because of some notion that this is going to help prolong their lives.
And they're going to prolong their lives any way that they can, even if that means spending the end of their days in an underground missile silo eating beans out of a can, hoping that their hired security doesn't rise up and overthrow their oppressor.
So it's just crazy. I think this just shows the insanity of we're in late stage capitalism, and this is where things are going. Well, that's as good of anything to end on. As always, I can be contacted at HumvaDev on Twitter or many other places that you can find in the show notes.
You can find me at LA_socialistRA on Twitter, Los Angeles chapter.
Yep. They will be that Los Angeles chapter will be very important when the big one hits and California sinks off into the ocean.
Honestly, as long as Orange County goes too, I wouldn't call it a total loss.
Yeah. I think that's another prediction that Deus Ex made, actually, that if we're going to go ahead and say Deus Ex is a prophetic game, Deus Ex says in the 2030s, I believe, that California just straight up slides off into the ocean. It's not really explained very well in the games. It's just there as flavor text that one day really big earthquake happened and just the whole of California just gone to the ocean floor.
It is what it is. As long as I get those cool, snazzy, bionic sunglasses eventually, I guess Trump is worth it.
Well, everyone, we wish you a good night in Trump's America, and just remember, when the big one hits, when the meteor falls from the sky, when the EMP happens, when the North Koreans attack...
That's when it becomes our America.
Exactly. Good night, everyone, and seize the means of production.
Solidarity forever.